When a legend dies, the world loses an icon, but the one left behind loses a future. For Christina Haag, that future was with a man the world called a prince, but who she knew only as John. She was his one escape, his brief taste of an ordinary life. For 5 years, their love story was woven not in headlines, but in sunsets on a kayak, a secret world built to flee the suffocating shadow of his own legend. Years later, when the silence became unbearable, she chose to tell her story, not to expose an icon, but to reclaim the man. This is the story of the woman who stood on the edge of a different life before fate pushed her away. To understand the world that both created and constrained John F. Kennedy Jr. and Christina Haag, we must step back into the late 1970s and 1980s. It was an era of transition, a bridge between the analog past and the digital future. America was emerging from the cynicism of the 1970s, a decade marked by Vietnam, Watergate, and economic uncertainty. The 1980s roared in with a new, brash confidence, defined by Wall Street ambition, pop culture excess, and a renewed sense of glamour. It was the age of Reagan, of blockbuster movies, MTV, and the dawn of the 24-hour news cycle. For the Kennedy family, it was a time of regrouping. The golden era of Camelot was a distant, painful memory. The assassinations of John F. Kennedy in 1963 and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968 had left a permanent scar on the American psyche and on the family itself. The surviving brother, Ted Kennedy, carried the political torch, but his own career was forever shadowed by the Chappaquiddick incident of 1969. The family was still political royalty, but they were also a dynasty marked by an almost mythological sense of tragedy. Into this complex legacy, John F. Kennedy Jr. was growing up. From the moment of his birth, he was public property. The world had watched him take his first steps in the White House. They had mourned with him. Now they watched his every move as he grew from a boy into a man. He was, by any measure, the most famous young man in the world, burdened with a face and a name that were instantly recognizable. He was endlessly photographed, speculated about, and projected upon. The public craved a continuation of the Camelot story, and they cast him in the leading role. Every girlfriend was a potential princess. Every career move a prelude to a presumed political destiny. The pressure was immense and inescapable. He was a man desperately searching for a private identity in a world that would only allow him a public one. Christina Haag's world was entirely different. She grew up in the sophisticated, artistic milieu of New York City's Upper West Side. Her father was an investment banker, but the family's sensibilities were more literary and creative. It was a world of theater, books, and intellectual curiosity. It was a world of privilege, to be sure, but it was a private privilege, one that valued artistry and intellect over fame and political power. While John was being groomed under the watchful eye of the world, and his famously protective mother, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, Christina was pursuing a passion for acting, studying at the prestigious Juilliard School, before heading to Brown University. Brown University in the late 1970s and early 1980s was a bastion of Ivy League liberalism, a place that attracted independent, creative, and intellectually driven students. It was here, in this incubator of a less formal, less hierarchical generation, that their two very different worlds would first collide. It was a setting where, for a brief time, he could be just another student and she could be an artist, finding her voice. They were not yet the figures they would become, but the seeds of their future were planted in this shared space, a friendship that would lie dormant for years before blossoming into one of the most significant and least understood romances of John F. Kennedy Jr.'s life. Their story was not just about two people falling in love. It was about two different Americas, two different kinds of legacy trying to find a common ground. The sound, when it came, was so ordinary that it was jarring. 3 soft, hesitant knocks against the wood of the apartment door. In the spring of 1985, Christina Haag's world had shrunk to the 4 walls of her modest Upper West Side apartment, a space that felt less like a home and more like a container for a grief she couldn't articulate. A recent painful breakup had left her emotionally adrift, her heart a raw and tender wound. She moved through her days in a fog of sorrow, the vibrant energy of New York City muted and distant. It was in this state of quiet desolation, curled on her sofa with tears blurring her vision, that the knock came. She ignored it at first, assuming it was a delivery or a neighbor, but it came again, this time a little more insistent. With a sigh, she pulled herself up, wiping her eyes, and went to the door. When she opened it, the world outside her small sphere of sadness rushed in. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, looking both familiar and completely out of place, was John F. Kennedy, Jr. He hadn't called, hadn't been a regular presence in her life for some time. They were friends, yes, but their paths since college had been divergent. He inhabited a universe of flashbulbs and expectations, while she lived in the determined, often lonely world of her craft. He offered a slightly sheepish, impossibly charming smile. He explained he was there for a haircut from her roommate, a casual request that seemed a flimsy excuse for his sudden appearance. As he stepped inside, the carefully constructed wall around her sorrow crumbled. He took one look at her face, at the redness in her eyes and the tremor in her lip, and the pretense of the haircut vanished. The public persona, the guarded heir to Camelot, dissolved in an instant, replaced by the concerned, empathetic friend she remembered from Brown. "Hey," he said, his voice gentle. "Are you okay?" It was a simple question, but in her fragile state it was everything. He didn't pry or offer platitudes, he simply saw her. In that moment of unvarnished vulnerability, the stable, platonic ground of their old friendship began to shift, giving way to something deeper and far more profound. He stayed. The haircut was forgotten. For hours they sat and talked as the afternoon light faded into the electric blue of a New York evening. She spoke of her heartbreak, and he listened with an attentiveness that felt like a physical comfort. He, in turn, spoke of the strange, gilded cage of his own life, the loneliness that came with being universally known but rarely understood. In the shared intimacy of her small living room, they were not John F. Kennedy, Jr. and an aspiring actress. They were just John and Christina, two people navigating the messy, beautiful, and often painful terrain of their late 20s. A simple act of kindness, of a friend showing up when he was needed, had cracked open the door to a new world. A few days later, the phone rang. It was John. "I was wondering," he started, a hint of uncharacteristic hesitation in his voice, "if you'd like to see a play." Their first official date was as unpretentious as the conversation that had sparked it. It wasn't a premiere or a high society gala. It was a small, intense off-Broadway show, the kind of theater Christina lived and breathed. Afterward, instead of being whisked away in a limousine, they walked. They walked for miles through the city streets, the noise of the traffic and the murmur of the crowds forming a cocoon around them. The walk was filled with easy conversation and comfortable silences. For Christina, it felt like a homecoming to a place she hadn't known she'd been missing. For John, it was a taste of the one thing he craved above all else, normalcy. In a life composed of extraordinary events, this simple, ordinary evening felt like a miracle. From that night forward, their relationship blossomed, defined from its very inception by a mutual, unspoken pact. They would build a world for themselves, a sanctuary shielded from the relentless glare of his public life. John, a man who had been stared at since birth, who couldn't buy a newspaper or walk down the street without causing a stir, found a profound sense of peace in the anonymity he could achieve with Christina. She was not interested in his fame, she was interested in him. She was grounded in her own ambitions, her own circle of friends, her own artistic passions. This self-possession was a powerful anchor for him. When he was with her, the crushing weight of his legacy seemed to lift. He wasn't the prince of a fallen kingdom. He was John, a man who loved to laugh, who could be goofy and deeply introspective, and who was in the midst of a lifelong struggle to reconcile the man he was with the symbol he was forced to be. They constructed their life together not around society events, but around simple, often athletic pleasures that allowed them to connect with each other and with the physical world. They became a familiar, if discreet, presence in the everyday fabric of New York. On weekends, they would take their bicycles and race through the winding paths of Central Park, the wind in their faces, their laughter echoing through the trees. They would strap on rollerblades and glide along the Hudson River waterfront at dusk, moving in sync with the rhythm of the city, yet entirely lost in their own world. These were stolen moments of freedom, small rebellions against the life of confinement that fame had imposed upon him. Of all their shared passions, one activity came to define the very essence of their relationship: kayaking. A kayak for them was more than a boat. It was a vessel of escape, a private craft that allowed them to literally paddle away from the world. In her memoir, Christina would later describe these moments with a lyrical, aching tenderness. The ritual itself was a meditation, loading the two-person kayak onto his Jeep, driving out of the city to a quiet body of water, the shared effort of carrying it to the shore. Then the magic would happen. As they pushed off from the land, a profound silence would envelop them. The only sounds were the gentle dip and pull of their paddles in the water, the call of a distant bird, the whisper of the wind. On the water, they were utterly alone, a self-contained unit moving through the vastness of nature. They would paddle for hours, often in silence, communicating through the shared rhythm of their strokes. They would watch the sun set, the sky bleeding into impossible shades of orange and purple, the light dancing on the water's surface. In those moments, suspended between the water and the sky, the pressures of the world, the paparazzi, the expectations, the tragic weight of his family's history would recede until they were nothing more than a faint, distant hum. He was no longer a Kennedy. She was no longer a struggling actress. They were two people together in a boat, experiencing something elemental and true. This was the heart of their sanctuary. It was not a place, but a state of being they created together, brick by brick, paddle stroke by paddle stroke, against the relentless tide of the outside world. The foundation of this sanctuary was the profound sense that Christina knew and loved John. She saw the man who was fascinated by history, who read voraciously, who possessed a keen and often wickedly funny intelligence. She saw the man who could be plagued by self-doubt, who felt the ghost of his father not as a political inspiration, but as an intimate personal loss. He, in turn, found in her world a place of authenticity. He would attend her plays, sitting in the dark of a small theater, just another anonymous face in the audience, watching her transform on stage. He was immensely proud of her talent and respected the discipline her craft required. He spent time with her friends, a collection of actors, writers, and artists who engaged him in debates about books and ideas, completely unimpressed by his celebrity. In her world, he was not required to be a symbol. He was simply invited to be a participant. Their life was an intricate tapestry woven from two different threads. One day, they might be having a quiet, simple dinner at her apartment, and the next, he might have to attend a formal Kennedy family function, a world of coded language and immense historical weight. But he always returned to the sanctuary they had built. He would come back to her, shedding the armor he wore for the outside world, and become John again. Their relationship was a quiet, steadfast rebellion. In a life where everything was public, they had succeeded in creating something that was exquisitely, fiercely, and beautifully private. Their love story was not written for the headlines. It was whispered in the silence of a kayak at dusk, a secret language understood only by two. The 5 years that Christina Haag and John F. Kennedy Jr. spent together were an intricate dance, a masterclass in living a double life. In one life, they were simply John and Christina, a young couple in love in New York City, their world defined by the intimate geography of her Upper West Side apartment, the winding paths of Central Park, and the silent, expansive surfaces of the waters they kayaked. But in the other life, the one that existed in the public imagination, he was John F. Kennedy Jr., and their relationship was a matter of national speculation. Their private sanctuary, so carefully constructed, was a beautiful but fragile structure, and they both knew it stood in the shadow of a far larger and more imposing edifice, the Kennedy legacy. For their love to truly endure, it had to be brought inside those hallowed, haunted walls. It had to be presented to the dynasty's undisputed protector and queen, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. The prospect of meeting Jackie was for Christina a thing of profound and terrifying significance. This was not a typical meet the parents moment. This was an audience with a living icon, a woman who had weathered the brightest spotlights and the darkest tragedies of the 20th century with a superhuman grace. She was the guardian of the Camelot flame, and more importantly, the fiercely protective mother who had spent decades shielding her children from the invasive and often dangerous world that had taken their father. John spoke of his mother with a mixture of deep love, profound respect, and a hint of dutiful trepidation. Her approval was not just important, it was the foundation upon which any serious future could be built. The invitation, when it came, was characteristically understated. "My mother would like to have you for tea," John announced one afternoon, his casual tone belying the weight of the statement. The days leading up to the meeting were a blur of anxiety for Christina. She agonized over what to wear, what to say, how to present herself. How could she, a struggling actress living a bohemian life, possibly measure up to the expectations surrounding the woman who might one day marry America's prince? John was endlessly reassuring, telling her, "Just be yourself. That's who I want her to meet." The address itself was legendary, 1045th Avenue. The doorman, the elevator ride, the quiet hallway, it all felt like a procession into history. John opened the apartment door and Christina stepped out of the bustle of New York City and into a world of serene, impeccable taste. The apartment was not a palace but a home, yet every object within it seemed to resonate with historical significance. Sunlight streamed through large windows overlooking Central Park, illuminating rooms filled with priceless art, shelves overflowing with books and photographs that were, to the rest of the world, iconic images, but were here simply family portraits. It was a home that was both a private residence and a living museum, and its curator was about to pass judgment. Jackie emerged from her library, and she was exactly as the world knew her, yet entirely different. She was smaller, more delicate than she appeared in photographs. Her famous whisper-soft voice was even quieter in person, forcing one to lean in, to focus completely. Initially, she was reserved, her eyes watchful, her smile polite but guarded. It was a formidable barrier, honed over decades of public scrutiny. Christina felt her own nervousness spike, her carefully rehearsed pleasantries evaporating in the face of this quiet intensity. But Jackie was not just a gatekeeper. She was a woman of deep and genuine cultural interests. She did not ask about John, or their relationship, or the prying press. Instead, she asked Christina about the plays she was reading, about the director she admired, about her studies at Juilliard and Brown. She saw in Christina not a potential daughter-in-law vying for a position, but a fellow traveler in the world of the arts. She recognized a serious, intelligent, and independent young woman whose ambitions were entirely her own, existing outside the powerful gravity of the Kennedy name. This was Christina's truth, and in this rarefied air, it was her greatest asset. Over the course of that first meeting, and in subsequent dinners and visits, Christina felt the legendary reserve begin to melt, replaced by a surprising and genuine warmth. Jackie's initial assessment gave way to a quiet affection. She saw that Christina was a stabilizing force in her son's chaotic life. She appreciated that Christina's world offered John a refuge, a place where he wasn't a living monument, but a man loved for his own character. The maternal blessing, when it became clear, was not a formal declaration, but a series of small, meaningful gestures. An invitation to a family dinner, a shared confidence, a look of approval. It was a powerful affirmation that their relationship was not just a fleeting romance, but a union that was seen as a real and welcome possibility within the family. With this familial acceptance, the bond between John and Christina deepened, and their adventures together grew bolder, becoming a blend of the epic and the intimate. They traveled not to glamorous resorts, but to places that held a private, almost sacred, meaning. The most significant of these journeys was a pilgrimage to the Solomon Islands. It was John's idea, born from a deep-seated need to connect with the Father he knew only through stories and images. He wanted to find the remote, uninhabited island where a young Lieutenant John F. Kennedy had washed ashore after his patrol boat, the PT-109, was sliced in half by a Japanese destroyer during the World War II. The journey was arduous. It involved long flights, travel in rustic boats, and navigating a part of the world largely untouched by tourism. Their final approach to the island was by kayak, a grueling paddle across miles of open turquoise water under a blazing sun. For John, this physical trial was part of the tribute. As they paddled, he was connecting not with the president in the history books, but with the 26-year-old man who had survived against impossible odds, who had saved his crew through sheer force of will. To share this intensely personal quest with Christina was the ultimate act of intimacy. When they finally dragged their kayak onto the white sand of the deserted island, a profound silence fell between them. This was the spot. This was where his father had fought for his life. John walked the beach, his face a mask of complex emotions, touching a history that was both world-famous and deeply, achingly his own. In that moment, Christina was not just his partner. She was a witness to the deepest part of his search for himself. This experience, so far removed from the glitz of Hyannisport or the political theater of Washington, forged a bond between them that felt unbreakable, a shared secret and a shared reverence. The depth of his trust in her was symbolized by a simple, powerful gesture. One evening, he presented her with a small, worn silver disc. It was a St. Christopher medal, the patron saint of travelers. "This was my father's," he said quietly. It was a deeply personal heirloom, a token carried by a man on his own perilous journeys. To give it to her was more significant than any diamond ring. It was a quiet passing of a legacy, an entrustment of his family's heart, a symbol of protection given from one generation to the next, through him to her. He was bringing her into the very core of his family's story, while she, in turn, continued to ground him in the simple reality of hers. He was as comfortable having a humble dinner with her parents as he was navigating a state dinner, a testament to the seamless way their two worlds had merged. Yet, no matter how strong their private bond became, the idyllic sanctuary they had built was a bubble under constant pressure. The outside world was always pressing in, its lens focused, its microphone on. The paparazzi were a constant, menacing presence. A simple walk to the grocery store could devolve into a frantic chase, the sound of clicking shutters like a swarm of angry insects. Christina, a fundamentally private person, found the experience suffocating. She describes the feeling of being hunted, the jarring transition from a moment of private intimacy to public spectacle. John, who had lived with this intrusion his entire life, had a complicated and volatile relationship with the press. He could be charming and playful, using his wit to disarm them, but at other times, the relentless invasion would trigger a raw, explosive anger that frightened Christina. She would see the easygoing man she loved transform into a caged animal, lashing out at the photographers who treated him like public property. For her, it was a deeply unsettling glimpse into the psychological cost of his fame. The constant state of siege began to wear away at the foundations of their peace, turning the city they loved into a hostile territory. The very forces they had tried to escape in their kayak were proving to be inescapable on land, and the beautiful private world they had fought so hard to create was showing its first ominous fault lines. A great love story rarely ends with a single thunderous crash. More often it dies by 1,000 cuts, a slow erosion of the foundations by forces both external and internal until the entire structure, once a sanctuary, becomes untenable. For Christina Haag and John F. Kennedy Jr., the end of their 5-year love affair was a heartbreaking, protracted process of unraveling. The private world they had so meticulously built, a world of silent kayaking and shared laughter in the anonymity of the city, was besieged from the outside and strained from within. The question of their future, once a shared and unspoken dream, slowly became a source of tension, a painful conversation they could no longer avoid. The most relentless and corrosive force was the one they could never control, the media. As John moved towards his 30th birthday, the public's obsession with his life reached a fever pitch. The narrative was irresistible. The handsome Prince of Camelot had come of age, and it was time for him to choose his princess and claim his throne. The question of who he would marry was treated not as a private decision, but as a matter of national interest, a spectator sport played out on the glossy covers of magazines in every supermarket checkout line. For Christina, a fiercely private person, this level of scrutiny was more than just an annoyance. It was an assault on her very identity. In her own world, she was a dedicated artist, a woman of intellect and ambition. But in the public eye, she was reduced to a single defining role: JFK Jr.'s girlfriend. Her own accomplishments were rendered invisible, her identity becoming a mere adjunct to his fame. A successful run in a play was mentioned only in the context of John being in the audience. Her name in print was almost always a subordinate clause to his. This slow erasure of her own selfhood was profoundly painful. Their lives became a series of strategic maneuvers to avoid detection. A simple dinner out required a reservation under a false name and an exit through a kitchen or a back alley. A weekend getaway, intended to be a moment of peace, would end with their faces splashed across a tabloid, a private moment of affection twisted into a sensational headline for public consumption. The constant state of siege created an environment of pervasive anxiety, the very antithesis of the peace they had sought and found in each other. John's reactions to this relentless hounding grew more volatile. The charming deflection he often employed would sometimes crack, revealing a deep well of rage. Christina witnessed this transformation with growing alarm. The man she loved, contorted by a fury at his gilded cage, his frustration boiling over in confrontations with photographers that left her shaken. Compounding this immense external pressure was a growing restlessness within John himself. The path that everyone expected him to take, a law career as a stepping stone to politics, felt like an ill-fitting suit. He honored his family's legacy, but he did not want to simply repeat it. He was searching for a way to engage with the world that was uniquely his, a way to make his own mark. He was caught in a profound tug of war. His heart yearned for the simple, authentic life he had with Christina, but the weight of his name and the spark of his own ambition pulled him in another direction. It was during this period of internal conflict that the idea for George magazine began to take shape in his mind. It was a concept that was both brilliant and, for their relationship, deeply dangerous. A magazine that would treat politics not as a dry, inaccessible subject for the elite, but with the glossy, populist glamour of pop culture. It would be smart, irreverent, and visually stunning. It was a way for him to step into the national conversation, to be a publisher and a tastemaker, to use his unique position at the intersection of celebrity and policy. To launch it, however, John would have to do the one thing their relationship was built to avoid. He would have to step directly into the center of the spotlight. He would need to leverage his fame, court advertisers, appear on talk shows, and become a public personality in a way he never had before. His ambition, his solution to the problem of his legacy, was on a direct collision course with the private life he and Christina had so carefully cultivated. As this internal and external landscape was shifting, another figure entered the picture, a person who seemed to embody the world John was gravitating towards, the actress Daryl Hannah. The narrative is often simplified to John leaving Christina for Daryl, but the reality, as Christina would later portray it, was far more nuanced and heartbreaking. Daryl Hannah was not the cause of the breakup. She was a symptom of a deeper divergence. John and Daryl had known each other for years, moving in similar celebrity circles. She was a star of a different magnitude, a Hollywood A-lister who lived a life that was by its nature public. Unlike Christina's quiet, artistic world, which stood in opposition to John's fame, Daryl's world was a mirror of it. His growing connection to her was a painful manifestation of his drift away from their shared sanctuary. It signaled a choice. He was being drawn to a life lived entirely within the dazzling, high-profile world of celebrity, a life where constant public attention was not a bug, but a feature. For Christina, observing this shift was agonizing. It was a sign that the man who had once cherished their anonymity above all else was now being pulled toward the very life he had claimed to despise. Their breakup was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, painful acknowledgement of an unavoidable truth. Their final conversations were not filled with anger or accusations, but with a profound and shared sorrow. They were deeply intertwined, their love a central part of their identities. But the core conflict had become insurmountable. Christina wanted a future centered on family, her art, and the precious privacy they had once shared. John, while still wanting those things, felt an undeniable pull toward a grander public stage, a need to finally stop running from his legacy and instead find a way to shape it on his own terms. They were two people who still loved each other deeply, but whose fundamental desires for their lives had become irreconcilable. "I don't think you'll ever be happy just being a private person," she told him, a tearful admission of a truth they both knew. The separation in 1990 was devastating. For Christina, it was the loss of not just the love of her life, but of the future she had so wholly believed in. She had navigated the treacherous waters of the Kennedy dynasty, earned the affection of his formidable mother, and built a real, tangible life with a man she adored. To have it all crumble under the weight of his fame and his ambition left a profound void. For John, the breakup was a definitive turning point. It marked the end of his 5-year attempt to live a quasi-normal life, a chapter defined by the quiet love he shared with Christina. It was the beginning of his full embrace of his public persona. The path was now clear for the launch of George magazine, for a life lived at the center of the media storm, and eventually for his marriage to Carolyn Bessette, a woman who, like him, would be both elevated and ultimately consumed by the blinding glare of public life. The end of his relationship with Christina was the closing of a door, a final wistful goodbye to the possibility of a quiet life for the man the world knew as John. In the years that followed their separation, Christina Haag's life continued on its determined, quiet trajectory, forever linked in the public mind to a chapter she had privately closed. She did not disappear, nor did she attempt to leverage her past relationship for fame. Instead, she did precisely what she had always intended to do. She focused on her work. She poured her energy into her acting career, taking roles in films, on television, and in the theater, building a life of her own making, piece by piece, painstaking piece, far from the gravitational pull of the Kennedy sphere. It was a life of dignity and purpose, lived on her own terms. From this respectful distance, she watched as John's life accelerated into the new, intensely public phase he had chosen. The nascent idea that had been a point of friction between them, George magazine, became a reality in 1995. It launched to enormous fanfare, a glossy, audacious, and successful venture that perfectly captured the zeitgeist of the 1990s. John, as its editor-in-chief, was no longer just a reluctant icon. He was a media mogul, a publisher who had found a brilliant and innovative way to engage with his legacy. A year later, in 1996, he married Carolyn Bessette in a secret ceremony on a remote Georgia island, a final dramatic attempt to reclaim a moment of privacy before he and his new wife were catapulted into the stratosphere of global celebrity. The world was captivated. John and Carolyn became the ultimate power couple, the modern embodiment of the Camelot myth. They were impossibly beautiful, impossibly stylish, and impossibly famous. Every photograph of them, whether leaving their Tribeca apartment or attending a state dinner, became an iconic image. But Christina, who had known the man behind the image, could only have watched this new chapter with a complex mix of emotions. She would have recognized the familiar pressures, the hunt of the paparazzi, the struggle to maintain a private self, now amplified to an almost unimaginable degree. She was seeing him build a life so profoundly different from the quiet, simple one they had once planned together in the sanctuary of a 2-person kayak. Then on a hot summer evening, July 16, 1999, the unthinkable happened. The narrative of triumph and tragedy that had defined the Kennedy family for generations found its most heartbreaking final chapter. The single-engine plane John was piloting, carrying him, Carolyn, and her sister Lauren to a family wedding, vanished from radar screens over the Atlantic Ocean. The world held its breath. The frantic, desperate search gave way to a grim, inevitable discovery. The wreckage was found, and a nation that had watched him grow up was plunged into a state of collective mourning. The beautiful doomed prince, the little boy who had saluted his father's casket, was gone. For Christina, the news was not a public tragedy, but a devastating, deeply personal blow. The loss was not of an icon, but of her first great love, the man whose heart she had known with an intimacy few others ever could. In her memoir, she would later write of the moment she heard the news, of the disorienting shock and the flood of memories that came rushing back, not of the public figure, but of John, the way he laughed, the look in his eyes when he was truly listening, the feel of his hand in hers. His death created what she called a ghost limb, the phantom ache of a love that had been severed but was still and would always be a part of her. His story was now sealed in tragedy, forever freezing him in time. For more than a decade after his death, Christina remained silent. The world, hungry for any new detail about the fallen prince, would have eagerly consumed her story. But she guarded the privacy of their years together as fiercely in his death as they both had in his life. It was an act of profound respect, a refusal to commodify her memories or capitalize on a tragedy. But eventually, she chose to write. In 2011, she published Come to the Edge. The decision was met with both anticipation and a degree of inherent cynicism. The world is often wary of memoirs involving the Kennedys, conditioned to expect salacious gossip, score-settling, or self-serving revisionism. Christina's book, however, was none of those things. It was a quiet, literary, and deeply personal account of her 5 years with John, a portrait of a love story, not a tell-all. The historical and emotional significance of her memoir is immense. For decades, the narrative of John F. Kennedy Jr. had been controlled by others, by the media that hunted him, by a public that idolized him, and by the immense weight of his own family's history. Christina's book was a powerful and necessary counter-narrative. It was one of the first and only accounts to offer a truly intimate glimpse into his inner world during his formative years as a young man. She revealed a John the world barely knew, a man who was not a reckless playboy, but a thoughtful, spiritual, and often goofy person who was a loving and dutiful son. She painted a portrait of a partner who sought normalcy above all else, who found his greatest peace not in the spotlight, but in the quiet moments away from it. She humanized him, stripping away the layers of myth to show the complex, sensitive, and searching person underneath. Her story gave him back a piece of the humanity that celebrity had stolen from him. Today, the story of their love transcends the specifics of the Kennedy legend. It has become a universal tale of love, loss, and the struggle to maintain a private self in a world that demands a public performance. It poses a timeless question. Can true intimacy survive under the weight of immense external pressure? From her experience, we learn of the exorbitant cost of fame and the fragile, fleeting beauty of a love that tries to exist in its shadow. Christina Haag's story is not a footnote to the life of JFK Jr. It is a vital chapter that reframes our understanding of the man. In the end, her memoir is a testament to a love that was real and deep, and a poignant reminder of the man the world lost, not just the prince it mourned. Christina's journey was not ultimately defined by the end of their relationship, but by her quiet dignity in the years that followed, and the ultimate courage it took to share her story on her own terms. It was her final beautiful gift to him. It did not tarnish his legacy, but deepened it, adding shades of vulnerability, thoughtfulness, and a profound yearning for connection that the public image so often flattened. She allowed us finally to see the John she knew and loved, and in doing so, she gave us a lasting tribute to a man who was, to someone simply and wonderfully human.